Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Today we will discuss the wave crest and trough and compressor, rarefaction in longitudinal waves, frequency, wavelength and amplitude. So first we will discuss the crest and trough in transverse waves. For example, this is a transverse waves and the highest point of this transverse waves. It means that this is the highest point of the transverse waves, and this highest point is known as the crest of transverse waves. It means the highest point, which is the upper part of the transverse waves, is known as crest of this transverse waves, and the lower point, the lowest point of this transverse waves, it means that the lower part of this transverse wave, which is the lowest point of the transverse wave, is known as trough. So this is the crest of the waves and this is the trough. So this wave has three crests and three troughs. The highest point is known as crest and the lowest point is known as trough. So in a longitudinal waves there will be compression and rarefaction. So where the particle are crowded together in a longitudinal waves will be the compression. For example, if we will see here or the particle are crowded, it means that the particle are close to each other, the particle are very close to each other. So this part of the transverse waves is known as compression and this part is known as rarefaction, because the particle in this part of the longitudinal waves are less crowded together. It means that the particles are far apart from one another. Therefore, this part of the wave is known as rarefaction. Now we will discuss the frequency. The number of waves passes per second is known as frequency. It means how many waves are passed in a second. For example, if 4 waves are passed in a second, the frequency will be 4 Hz. If 3 waves are passed in a second, then the frequency will be 3 Hz. If 2 waves are passes per second, will have the frequency of 2 Hz. So the frequency is the number of waves passes per second. How many waves are passed in a second is known as frequency. So we will discuss the wavelength. So wavelength is the distance occupied by one complete waves. For example, if a wave has one crest and one trough, this will be one complete wave, and the one complete waves occupy a distance. This distance will be the wavelength of the wave. It means that the distance occupied by one complete wave. So this is the distance that has been occupied by one complete wave. This distance is known as wavelength, or the distance between two crests or two troughs. These are two troughs and these are two crests of these waves. Distance between two crests or the distance between two troughs is also known as wavelength. So we can define the wavelength as a distance occupied by one complete wave, or the distance between two crests or two troughs is also known as wavelength. Now we will discuss amplitude. Amplitude is the maximum distance from the rest position to the trough of the waves or to the crest of the waves. This arrow indicates the amplitude. This is the rest position of the wave. This line indicates the rest position of the wave. This is the rest position of the waves. And from this rest position to the crest, or from this rest position to the trough, this height or this distance is known as the amplitude of the waves. From the rest position to the crest or from the rest position to the trough, this distance or this distance is known as amplitude of the waves.